So, hello everyone. We've got an interesting guest with us today. That's none other than Robert Falconer. My dear Bob is with us. He's going to educate us, talk about his experience, and is going to be an amazing session. So, thank you so much, Bob, for joining us today.
You're very welcome. I'm glad to be here.
Okay, before we dive deeper, Bob, I would like you to introduce yourself to my subscribers, my fellow therapist friends, and coaches out there. Who is Bob?
Okay. Well, I'm an old guy who lives in Santa Cruz, California, which is about an hour and a half south of San Francisco on the coast. I've been doing therapy for 50 years, and my own family background was extreme violent sexual and physical trauma. So that's where I started, and that was my focus for a very long time. Childhood sexual abuse and trauma. And then maybe 15 years ago now, I guess I met this being in a client who was not a part of that client, who, was something else.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't want to believe that was possible. It did not fit in my universe. It was amazingly disruptive, but I knew just basics in IFS about how to get these things, which IFS calls unattached burdens, out of a person. And I got it out of her. And then I thought, I'm just going to pretend this didn't happen. This is too weird. But then she started sending me these emails that ended up changing my life. She said, I feel totally changed by that session. I'm seeing colors I've never seen before.
Wow.
I can see the light of the divine in all the people in the airport. I thought, I've triggered a manic episode. And then the email that really changed my life. I didn't tell you this or anyone at the training, but back when I was young, I tried to kill myself many times and was institutionalized many times. And when I tried to tell somebody back then about the non-human inside of me, they gave me electroshock and horrible drugs. You are the first human being that ever believed me, and this has changed my life. And then I went, I can't ignore this. As much as I would like to just sail on by, no, I can't ignore this. So for 15 years now, this has been a focus. And most other therapists don't want to deal with this. It's too weird. Same reaction I have. So I get a lot of referrals. So that's who I am in a very, very brief. Oh, and I work with IFS primarily. I think it's the most potent and respectful modality for working with survivors of childhood sexual abuse and trauma.
Okay, Bob, could you please tell us, what part of your journey, what important part of your life, the entire journey, that actually influenced your decision to specialize in internal family system therapy?
Okay.
What was that point?
Well, I had worked with many other parts work models. I had come to believe very early on that I, at least, and now I think pretty much everybody, is not one unified thing. We're a system of pretty well encapsulated small parts that are sparsely interlinked with each other. And there are philosophers who argue this is the necessary structure of mind. But anyway, I knew I was like that, so I worked with all these different parts work models, starting with probably the first was the Gestalt, as it was taught at the Institute here. And then I got to know Jack and Helen Watkins, the founders and creators of ego state therapy, which is, that uses hypnosis or altered states of consciousness to work with these parts. And then there was a transactional analysis was very early on. The 12 steps, and especially the adult children of alcoholics movements and their popularization of the idea of inner children. In the 12-step tradition, Pia Melody and her work, she called her stuff post-induction therapy. But she clearly worked with parts too. And there's also psychosynthesis and voice dialogue and a
Mm-hmm.
few others along the way.
Mm-hmm.
So I came and my own therapist, who I've worked with for many decades, had her own way of working with parts. She didn't call them parts, she calls them the insiders. So I had, I had all these different things. And when I found IFS, it seemed to be the most coherent and powerful. And I think it's the most respectful and potent. And I think it is potent because it is respectful. And I didn't used to put those two words together like that, but I think that's very true now.
Mm-hmm. Great. So, Bob, you have just, shared with us that you have explored various therapeutic, modalities throughout your career. Now, I would want to know what aspects of IFS specifically, resonated with you that, most, led you into, the entire, attracting your focus onto IFS. What was
Okay.
about IFS that attracted you and not others?
Yeah. Well, there are two major things. The first one is IFS recognizes that this system that we are is a delicate ecology. And we don't want to just go blasting in there and work on one part without permission from the rest of the system. And many of the earlier trauma-oriented methods, parts work methods, when they found the wounded child, they just went wham right in there, no matter what the rest of the system thought.
Mm-hmm.
And that created very dramatic workshops, but it damaged a lot of people. And there was all this chaos after those big sessions. So Dick recognized that there are protectors who've been trying to keep these very, very hurt, vulnerable young parts safe. Sometimes by managing stuff so they never get triggered, other times by drinking a lot or doing some other behavior to tamp down their big emotions when it comes up, and that you need to get the protector's permission first. You don't just go rushing into the exile. So it's very respectful of the delicate ecology of who we are. So that's the first point.
Mm-hmm.
There's only one other parts work model that recognizes this protector exile division, and that's Pia Melody in her work. But that's a sort of side point. The other thing is Dick talks a lot about the recognition of self. He says that we all have something in us that's not really a part. It's who we really, really are. When all the other parts have sort of unblended and stepped back, we are this self. And it's like the sun after a horrible, horrible storm, blown your house down, floods, trees over, no power, just a total mess. But when those clouds part, the sun is there, it's undamaged, it's not even dirtied, it's still there. And Dick's message, I believe, or the way I interpret Dick's message is, for me and other people who experienced terrible trauma and abuse, we are undamaged. All those perpetrators could never get to who we really, really are. And that when we get all those hurt parts to step back a little bit, that essence of us can flow out into the world again. Most other therapists and therapies, basically their attitude was, you're damaged, you'll never be okay, expect to limp along in a miserable little life, you never got the attachment, and 20, 30, 40 years with a therapist, maybe you'll be semi-okay. And Dick says, no, who you really are is undamaged, not even dirty. And that is a life-changing message for a lot of people with severe trauma histories and severe abandonment histories, the big attachment stuff. This is very different than what most other therapies were saying. And this self, which he came to say later in his work is the most important part of IFS, also opens the door to spirit and spirituality and contact with what the 12 steps would call a higher power. And I think this is really, really necessary. And it's very sad that it's been largely exiled and driven out of therapeutic interactions.
Absolutely. Bob, in your book, The Others Within Us, you delve into the concept of unattached burdens. I mean, that's a very common thing that we get to read, quite often in the book. So could you please explain me, as well as, my viewers, what these are and how they manifest in individuals' life? If you could just simplify, for us
Mhm.
beginners.
Yeah, okay. Mostly when we go inside and we start interacting, it's parts we interact with. They're various parts of us. They're like hurt little children, and then usually more teenagers who are kind of angry and rebellious, want to scream insults at us, and and we relate to them, and we realize they're all good. None of them are bad. A lot of them have huge burdens, and we help them unload those burdens. And the model for this kind of healing is, it's like most people walk around the planet and they're in a state of internal civil war. Most of their life energy goes into fighting themselves, and that's very sad, but I think that's literally true. And the goal of IFS is to convert this inner civil war into like an orchestra or a band or a dance troupe or a sports team that functions well together. We're not trying to homogenize all the parts and make it one thing. As we go in deeper and deeper to this kind of work, we start to discover that there are things inside of people that are not from their own personal lifetime, that are not parts of them specifically. They're from somewhere else. The first ones we usually discover are legacy burdens, things that were passed down through the family. And this is easier for most people to accept because there's hard science behind this now. There's the science of epigenetics, and there's the Diaz wrestler experiment. And, we can show hard sciences, this stuff is here. So even the most hard-headed materialist will usually go, yeah, that's real, and we can work with that. There's also stuff inside of people as you go farther and farther into their inner world that's not from their lifetime. It's not from their legacy. It's not from their ancestors. It comes from somewhere else. And some of these things are very negative, which IFS calls unattached burdens, and some are very positive, which IFS calls guides. I think IFS's decision to call them unattached burdens or guides is kind of unfortunate, because you have to decide what they are right at the beginning. As soon as one shows up, oh, this one's good, this one's bad. Yep. Tanya Luhrmann, a really wonderful anthropologist, she uses the expression spiritual presence experiences, because that's non-judgmental. That's where the title of my book comes from, The Others Within Us, because it's non-judgmental. It's just there are these energies in us that are bigger and foreign to us that can have huge impacts on who we are. Now, I want to go on just a little bit further with this. Probably some of your listeners are thinking, oh, this sounds like spirit possession.
Yes.
It is like spirit possession. And Dick hates it when I use that phrase. This is absolutely not okay to mention in psychotherapy. In America, anyway. A lot of other places it is. But what I like to say about this is there is a basic biopsychological dynamic that occurs in pretty much every culture we have records of and every era of history. And this dynamic can have powerful effects on people for good or for ill. The metaphor most usually used to describe this dynamic is spirit possession. But whatever metaphor we use, it's worthy of study because it's so powerful and it's found pretty much everywhere. So we should study this respectfully.
Wonderful. And I mean, like, with what you have said now, I mean, there's another question, that's, coming in my head. And the question is, Bob, how does, I mean, according to you, cultural belief and spiritual practices influence the way individuals experience and heal from unattached burdens within the IFS framework. If you could elaborate and shine some light.
Yeah, it has huge impact. One of the things that's happening in the UK is that
Mm-hmm.
many therapists there are more open to this because there's so many Islamic people, and they are very comfortable with jinn possession. They
Yeah.
know about this, and a lot of the IFS therapists in the UK are cooperating with the imams and the Islamic religious leaders who get these jinn
Yes.
out. And
Mm-hmm.
so that's, in an odd way, that's opening the door. So
Mm-hmm.
I try to stay with radical pragmatism. I don't know what's real in these very odd realms that are beyond what Western science recognizes. And I don't even try to really figure that out. Where I keep my focus is what helps the individual in front of me? What reduces their suffering? And that's radical pragmatism. And William James, sort of the big name in radical pragmatism,
Yes.
he
Mm-hmm.
went so far as to say, whatever works is what's real. So I try to keep my focus there. Does this help people if I do this? Does this help? And that's a much more answerable question. I get immediate feedback working with people and about, oh, this is helpful, this isn't. So I work really hard to keep my focus there. And about
Mm-hmm.
specific cultural stuff, I've worked all over the place. I've worked in Pakistan, China, Korea, Japan,
Wow.
Australia, Canada, Mexico, on and on. And I've worked with a lot of people from many different countries. And
Mm-hmm.
I accept whatever language they want to use. Whatever their metaphor system is, I'd have no need whatsoever to argue with it.
Mm-hmm. So, Bob, I mean, now this is a little personal. I would want to know from you. I mean, for my viewers also, I mean, since you have shared a very personal piece of information, on my podcast, so, I would like to add my bit as well. I'm also a survivor of child, sexual abuse. I was abused by my mother and my uncle. And I had, a lot of, traumatic, events in life. And to tell you honestly, Bob, I was an addict as well for quite some time. And then I recovered and I healed myself. But, the strangest thing that happened, I mean, that is the reason, IFS, I mean, the others within us, that book really makes sense to me. I mean, though we don't use IFS in India, I mean, it's not that popular. I mean, I have read about it, heard about it, but we don't use it often. I personally felt drug addiction, being exposed to anesthesia for a major surgery, these two were some kind of a portal for me. These two did connect me to something. I have got no words to it. People might say it's a possession, you need exorcism or this and that, but I don't know, but they are good. And I mean, they were really violent initially. I have that memory, but I personally feel that they do help, aid and enable. It's a very weird thing. I mean, you are an expert. I mean, you have worked with a lot of people, a lot of, different situations. And, I personally, that's the reason that this book really made sense. And I was curious that, why not reach Mr. Falconer and, bring him on the show and explain these things. So, Bob, does trauma trigger something, or does trauma awaken a part of you? If you could, shine some light on that.
Well, I think I'm going to step back a little bit to answer that question.
Yep.
Dick Schwartz and this parts work model have explored and deeply, deeply understood the multiple nature of mind. We're not one being, we're many. But I think we're not this isolated being. Our minds are porous and they're open to all sorts of other stuff. And there's all sorts of ways to measure this porosity. And if you start thinking about it, it's obvious. Every living system is surrounded by a semi-permeable membrane. It has to be, or it's dead. Our minds are no different. But in the West, and people who are educated in Western techniques, their operating system is based on this assumption that their mind is like a fortress or citadel. It's private. Everything inside it is ours, and it constitutes our identity. All three of those things are wrong. And they cause tremendous trouble. They look strong, at first glance, but they're actually really brittle. So they're very fragile. A person convinced of this citadel model of mind, they hear one voice that they don't recognize as theirs, and they flip out. They think my brain's broken. In a lot of other cultures, people can have that kind of experience and welcome it in a good way. Or at least not think they're totally damaged and destroyed, and not have it destroy their lives. Yes, what I think trauma does is it makes us more porous. It vastly increases our porosity. Now, and also, this is kind of not at the best time, to put it mildly, because there's somebody really nasty there when you're being traumatized. So their energy and their parts and any unattached burdens that were in them can get into you. So I think most people who are sexually abused get these energies into them from outside of themselves. Other things that increase porosity are surgery with anesthesia, especially childhood surgery. Kids who've had multiple surgeries when they were young, they almost always have some external energies in them or clinging to them. Psychedelic drugs increase porosity too, a lot. But I want to emphasize that most of these spirits or beings or whatever you want to call those things out there are benign. Like in the surveys of psychedelic drug users with psilocybin, about half of them meet conscious agentic beings,
Wow.
people. And they interact with them. 80-90% of those interactions are very positive. They call these beings they meet teachers, guides, wise one, wise woman, all kinds of descriptors like that. So I think it's in part because I'm a therapist and I worked with people who were primarily suffering, so I saw a lot of the more negative ones, but also because here with the modern Western worldview, we're told that anything like this is a disease process. So even benevolent energies, whatever we're going to call them today, we experience as bad and we try and expel. So yeah, there's all sorts of things that lower or higher our level of porosity. And there are 5 or 6 different scales that have been developed to measure this, which we can talk about if you have a therapist audience.
Absolutely. I mean, I've got a lot of therapists and a lot of people who are in recovery. But Bob, before you go down that way, I would like to know, are you trying to say that a traumatic event does create some kind of an exchange between the abuser and the victim?
It very often does. And that's
true. What kind of an exchange are we talking about? If you could,
it varies. Pia Melody, who I really, really, really admired, she just died a couple of weeks ago, which was very sad.
I'm so sorry.
A major influence on my life. She used to say that children have no really good emotional boundaries around them, and that when any adult was being irresponsible with their emotions in contact with that child, the child would absorb those emotions. So people who are abusing children are being irresponsible with their shame. So the kids almost always get some of the perpetrator's shame into them and think it's their own shame. They don't recognize this is not theirs. Also, there are other energies. Sometimes there are some of these unattached burdens in the perpetrator that can literally get passed on to the child they're abusing. So, yeah, I think this kind of stuff happens a lot.
And Bob, do you think that exchange also alters your personality?
Well, it's more like getting a parasite on you. Getting a parasite makes you feel weak and depleted,
Mm,
all of that. It doesn't really alter who you are.
mm-hmm. Wonderful. So, Bob, you have been a pioneer in speaking openly about, male childhood sexual abuse. I would want to know, how has this advocacy, impacted your therapeutic practice and the broader conversation around trauma?
Okay. Well, yeah, I was, and very early on, and most people, especially younger people, and almost everybody's younger than me these days, forget that it wasn't that long ago that the existence of child sexual abuse was denied by Western psychotherapy. There was a textbook of psychiatry, the major textbook used in America, that was first published in the late 1960s and continued being published until like 1976, I think, that said child sexual abuse is vanishingly rare, less than 1 in a million families, and when it happens, it's often good for the child.
Wha- Oh, God. Okay.
That was the official academic position about child
Yep.
sexual abuse when I started trying to deal with my history.
Mm-hmm.
And
Oh,
it
God.
kind of pissed me off.
It's obvious.
Yeah. And
Mm-hmm.
then PTSD, it's the same
Mm,
thing. All these institutions denied the reality of PTSD. And it was only because Robert Lifton, a psychiatrist, organized Vietnam War veterans because they had these rap groups.
yes.
They knew
Mm-hmm.
PTSD was real. They all had it,
Yep.
And he organized them, and they went and put pressure on Washington, on the government, and then the government forced the DSM, the academic professionals, to recognize PTSD. That did not occur until 1980.
Mm,
It was, and they were dragged kicking and screaming into the
mm-hmm.
recognition of trauma. I'm really glad they're recognizing trauma now. It's sometimes some snarky 12-year-old parts of me wish they'd apologize and say something like, we were so wrong for so long. But they
I
won't.
wish as well. Mm-hmm.
They won't. But
Mm-hmm.
I think I should just be grateful that they're recognizing it now.
Mm-hmm. So, Bob, now coming to, the 5 different, ways, to measure, you were talking about, and, we drifted away, onto some other, aspect.
Mm-hmm.
So if you could, elaborate for our, therapist friends and, coaches out there, what are the, ways, 5 different ways?
Most of these are written tests, scores.
Mm-hmm.
A very famous one is the schizotypy scale, developed
Mm-hmm.
by a guy, I'm forgetting his name, in the UK. And he started out just wanting to measure psychopathology. And he was looking, if schizophrenia is a real separate disease, if you measured this stuff, there should be a break. There should be a graph going like this and a break when you get up into the disease. You should all of a sudden have a different level of all these descriptors. That didn't happen. What he measured in thousands and thousands of these tests, it was a pretty smooth, it was kind of like this, not
Mm-hmm.
smooth, and it went up
Mm-hmm.
like this. And then what he noticed is, the people high up on this schizotype scale are also vastly more creative. And that was kind of upsetting to him. And then he realized they also have a lot more extrasensory perceptions and psi abilities.
Mm-hmm.
He realized also they had much more profound and vivid spiritual lives. And I think he's come to hold the schizotypy scale as a measure of one of the dimensions of being human, and that both ends of this have things that are wonderful and things that are difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's one. Another one I especially like is called the transliminality scale. It was developed in Australia, and I really like the name transliminal. A limen, it's a Latin word for threshold. Limen means across the threshold. And I just want the transliminality scale. They discovered the same thing. There's no big break. It's it's a curve like this, and there's good stuff and bad stuff at both ends. So, Isabel Clarke, a psychologist in the UK, makes the point that the word unconscious is a very, very inaccurate and almost dishonest word, because a lot of the things that we are not aware of actually have a consciousness of their own, and calling them unconscious sort of discounts them. And she suggests that we should, or subconscious, our contact with the divine comes from this. So when we're starting to call it the unconscious or the subconscious, we're already judging any potential spiritual connection as less than or negative. And it's built into our language, so it makes it almost impossible for us to think clearly. So Isabel Clarke has suggested that we just start using the name transliminal for the parts of us and the other energies and things that we are not currently aware of. I think that's a big improvement, but another jargon, oh my God. But the word unconscious and subconscious are really problematic. They make it hard or even impossible to think clearly. So this transliminality scale, Tanya Luhrmann, who is anthropologist, I think I mentioned earlier, who I think is one of the great minds on the planet today, she uses the Tellingen absorption scale, which basically measures how profoundly you can concentrate on something. How, like if you're reading a book, do you just become completely lost in the reading, or watching a movie? So it's how absorbed you get in whatever you're doing. And this is another measure that correlates with these other measures of porosity. And it obviously has good and bad stuff. I was in the library at the University of Chicago, where I got my undergraduate education in anthropology. And this guy sat down next to me who I recognized as one of the major professors, a famous scholar in Asian studies. And I went, oh. And then this huge stack of books fell over, and it went off like a rifle shot, this really loud noise. Everybody in the place went, ah! He didn't even notice it. He was so absorbed in what he was studying, he didn't hear this thing that was incredibly loud. So I think this is one of the reasons why he was a great scholar, was because he had this ability to become so absorbed. But people who are, quote, psychotic or schizophrenic also score very high on this absorption scale. So again, there's another one, the sensory delight scale. How much pleasure you can take in your sensory experiences correlates with this. There's also the Stanford hypnotizability scale. Now, there's a lot of boring arguments over whether or not this actually correlates with those other scales. I think it does, but I just want to say this one's disputed. Yeah, and there are more that I'm not calling to mind right now. But it's measurable. Now, we know this happens, and yet we behave in our day-to-day lives as though it's not true. Daniel Siegel, the guy who founded interpersonal neurobiology, talks about this same thing, and he calls it the myth of the solo self. That who we are is this encapsulated private thing, not interconnected to all these others. And he said this myth is so deeply embedded in the very grammar of our language that we cannot think clearly about who we are. And we need to create a new language. And I think he's got a point. In one of his books, he's trying to invent a new language, but it's so awkward. It's so difficult to think beyond this. You can do it rationally up here, but to actually into your operating system where it becomes what you live from, extremely difficult.
I personally feel, Bob, we are like onions, different layers. But the, question that I'm, seeking answer for is that do we really need trauma and pain to, open our eyes to the different, parts of us to activate them? Is there a happy way as well that exists? Or it's got to be a painful and traumatic way? What are your thoughts on that, Bob?
I have no idea. Usually the people who are in the happy way don't come to me. So my sample is incredibly skewed.
Mm-hmm.
But, pain is perhaps the better teacher because it's really hard to ignore.
Mm-hmm.
But no, I don't. It must be here for a reason because there's so much of it. Pretty much every religion suffering is right up there at the very, very forefront of what the religion talks about. So
I mean, I personally have read a couple of verses in Quran that says that, I mean, you should endure the suffering because he's testing, and then you will, be gifted with, freedom and paradise. So, I interpret, that paradise is where you can be happy with all your different selves. Everyone will coexist happy and they'll be there. You don't need to trigger them with pain. They all will be there with you present, and you'll be in connect with all of them. So I mean, you are absolutely right. Now coming to the multiplicity of the mind, Bob, IFS very strongly emphasizes the multiplicity of the mind. So how does recognizing and working with our internal parts facilitate healing, and especially for the trauma survivors, I mean the victims?
Okay, good question. Multiplicity is not created by trauma. We are born multiple beings, and it's a good thing. We could not function, and they know this with AI now and computers. If it was just one central processing unit, no matter how big that unit was, the computer would be an idiot. It has to have sparsely, largely contained, sparsely interlinked subroutines. That's sort of a key architecture of mind. But what trauma does, it pushes these divisions even further. Now, if you think of some kid being raped and beaten, it cannot contain that pain and continue to live. It can't be aware of that and wake up and go downstairs and know, oh, I'm dependent for my survival on the person who raped and beat me last night. So it encapsulates that, hides it away, buries it as far as it can, so that it can go on living. It's actually a wonderful skill to dissociate like that. It's a survival skill. It's not pathology. Dissociation is not pathology. It's a wonderful survival skill. And then when you've got this thing, this ball down there holding all this pain, then layers of protectors form to prevent that ball from being triggered and having all those flames of overwhelming emotion come up. And then another class of protectors, if all that emotion comes roaring up, this other class of protectors knows how to put those flames out. And this second class, which IFS calls firefighters, this is where addictions come from. Or it's how IFS considers addictions. Those parts are just, I'm going to stop this pain no matter what it costs, because it's just too much. It will destroy the person. So that's, in a ridiculously short, oversimplified view, how IFS works with trauma. And then what we do is we get permission from both of those sets of protectors to go work with the trauma. And then we go back there and witness that part so that it's no longer stuck alone with all that horrible suffering. And we can do that in ways that don't overwhelm the whole system. So let it out in a reasonable way, witness the part, get it out of where it's been stuck in the past, and help it unburden, shed, let go of all the extreme emotions and beliefs it took on back then. And then that exile is free, And when exiles are free, they're usually delightful. They're innocent, joy-filled, playful, like wonderful little kids, and they
Mm-hmm.
bring so much to the system. And then once the exile is free, those protectors who've been working so hard to keep that exile sort of contained like that, they can go on and have bigger, more rewarding jobs. They're not stuck in their role. Usually, if you talk to them for a while, they go, I hate what I'm doing, but I don't have any choice. I have to do this.
Mm-hmm. So, Bob, at any point in life, I mean, do these unattached burdens, I mean, the manager, the fighter, I mean, do they take a back seat? Do they leave us? Or,
Okay.
it's cyclical. Yeah.
Let me come in right away. The managers and the firefighters and the exiles are not unattached burdens. Those are two different things. Unattached burdens are not a part of the person's system, and the parts of a person's system can usually be categorized as managers, firefighters, and exiles. Two kinds of protectors, one group of exiles. So they're quite different things. No, I don't think, and Dick doesn't think, that it's we don't want to put it all in a blender and turn it to a mush. we want it to, like in an orchestra, it would be a terrible orchestra if everybody was playing the oboe. You need all the different instruments. You don't want to put them into a mush. So you want them all there, and you also want the presence of this self energy that we talked about, this who you really are core, that the entire system can sort of organize around, and the self can become the leader.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Bob, I would like to know, you said that these two things are different, unattached burdens and the, firefighters and the managers. Can unattached burdens become your manager? Just a question.
Not really. They can pretend, or they can come in and, get a hold of a manager and do a lot of stupid stuff trying to be in a manager role, but they can't really become a manager. A manager is a part of you, and an unattached burden is not a part of you. And that's like a fundamental difference.
So are we saying that unattached burden, I mean, the unattached burden's origin is not inside of us?
Right, exactly. Yep.
Okay, great.
It's not
so now
our family either. Who knows where it's from? It's not from inside of us, and it's not from our ancestors.
Okay, Bob, you talked about the state where we are very porous, we are like a sponge, we are very receptive. I mean, certain situations, creates or increases that porosity. Bob, I would like to know, does this unattached burden, I mean, as per, the IFS, modality system, does it hop from one person to the other, or does it wait for that porous moment? I mean, does it wait for that, state where you are very porous and then it goes in? I mean, how does the, transition, travel, or, hopping on happens? If you could just explain us in simple language.
Yeah. They can hop from one person to another. That does happen. And they usually, it isn't just a matter of porosity. The most common way these things get in is there's some kid being hurt, and it feels absolutely powerless, which it is. There's some adult abusing it. So the unattached burden comes in and says to the kid, hey, I'll offer you power. I've got power. Would you like some power? And the kid, of course, says, yeah, give me some power. And the trouble is, the unattached burden doesn't give real power. It might give the kid some numbing and some illusion of the power at the beginning, but then it keeps the kid powerless, because the unattached burden is a parasite that you could think of as feeding off the kid's energy. So it wants to keep the kid powerless so that the kid it can continue to feed. So the most common thing is these unattached burdens offer power to the powerless. They often also offer companionship to the abandoned. And there are other ways they can get into, but they almost always, they're offering something that's a lie, and that's how they get in.
So are you saying that the common way is through pain? Pain could be a portal to
Yeah,
invite them?
very pain, early anesthesia, all sorts of stuff like that. Yeah. Trauma.
And how are they really, Bob, in that case? I mean, you have explained how they come in. How do we, get rid of them? Is there a way at all?
Yeah. The first thing is you've got to make sure it's not a part. Almost all the things people find inside themselves, or the vast majority of things people find inside themselves, are parts. For example, let's look at somebody who hears a suicidal voice all the time.
Oh.
You got to kill yourself. You got to kill yourself. You're such a miserable. You got to kill yourself. You got to kill yourself. And they've been hearing this for years. Now, it could be a part, or it could be an unattached burden. Most people just want to kill that voice off. It makes sense. You'd like to amputate this, right? Get rid of it. Or it's like alcoholics a lot of the time. They just want the part of them that wants to get drunk to go away. Go away and die. I hate you, go away and die. But it doesn't.
True.
Yeah. So what you need to do is form a relationship with that voice. Say, oh, hi, what would be good about my being dead? And you have to conduct a patient interview or dialogue, and it'll often say something like, well, then you wouldn't be on the planet anymore. Well, what would be good about my not being on the planet anymore? And then if you keep going down layer after layer after layer, eventually it will say something like, if you weren't on the planet anymore, you wouldn't be suffering. That's a part. There's a good intention. Parts always, if you're patient enough to get to know them, they have a good intention behind their behaviors, even if their behaviors seem incredibly destructive. If it was an unattached burden that was saying, kill yourself, kill yourself, kill yourself, what's good about that? Then you wouldn't be on the planet anymore. What's good about them not being on the planet anymore? That means I win.
Wow. Yes.
No good intention whatsoever. So that's the first thing you do. You check the intention carefully and respectfully, because very often this is not clear at all. And then once it's as clear as you can get, is to know this thing has no good intention for me, no matter how patient I am in exploring in that direction. You just ask it directly, are you a part of me? And they lie all the time, but this is one thing they don't seem to be able to lie about. Now, at least the vast majority of the time they don't. I once said they never lie about this, and there was a woman in the group from Nigeria, and she bellowed out this huge voice, "They lie! They lie!"
Oh my God! Wow. Okay.
And after I recovered my sense of being the alleged leader of the group, I said, "Tell me more." And she said, "Well, in Nigeria, our traditions say they lie about this, and also that sometimes they've been in people or in that family of that person for so long they've forgotten who they really are." So I don't want to say 100% of the time they never lie about this, but it's very, very rare. So you just a lot of times they'll avoid the question, but you ask them. Then if it's not a part, you carefully say, you're not going to be able to stay here. You're going to have to move on. We're going to help you go to a place you can heal, or you could go back to, the darkness if you want. And then what we do is we very carefully check inside the person. Are any parts of you going to miss this thing when it's gone? It's been around a long time. Might have promised you a lot of good stuff. And then work with each one of those parts, establishing a loving relationship with it so that it's willing to connect with that person's self and not with this external energy. And then there's lots of other sort of visualization techniques we can use to make sure there are no connections left to the person. And then we just tell that thing, you got to go. And they do. When no parts want that thing around and no parts are afraid of it, it can't stay.
So basically, the parts inside of us has the ability to, in a way, get rid of the unattached burden. Is that what you're
Well,
saying?
I think that would be when the parts are willing to let it go, the self of the person, the whole system of the person can let it go. We don't want to tell the parts, you have to be responsible for this. All we need is their permission. Yeah, it's
Mm-hmm.
okay. I don't want that thing around anymore.
So can parts be responsible for keeping the unattached burdens?
I wouldn't put it on parts. It should be the self.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
We don't, parts are little kids usually. We don't want them driving the bus.
Wow.
Having a 3-year-old driving
Great
the
way
bus,
to put it across.
not a
Mm-hmm.
good idea.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Great. I personally feel, Bob, like, I mean, working with a lot of, people, I mean, here in my country, I mean, this is just my, personal way of looking at it. And plus, after reading your book and understanding, the IFS system and the modality, I mean, this is absolutely my view. I mean, people can, express their view. I personally feel cluster B has got to do something with UBs. I mean, I'm not trying to pathologize or, pin on something, but I personally feel there is some phenomena attached to especially cluster B. And I mean, what are your thoughts on? I mean, could it be a possibility?
Well, I hate diagnosis.
Yes.
All its forms. I think, I talked about IFS as being respectful.
Mm-hmm.
I think diagnosis is very disrespectful.
Mm-hmm.
It's taking the complex, never to be repeated reality of a person and putting a label on it, and then trying to force them to accept the label we put on them. I don't want to get involved with that.
Mm-hmm.
And, we have to sometimes. I mean, it's really unfortunate.
Yeah.
And I try not to make any generalized rules like that. I try to approach each person,
Mm-hmm.
each time, directly and freshly. If a person's sensing some big energy in them, like a voice telling them they need to kill themselves, or this big dark cloud that feels like it's really heavy on their left shoulder, or scary visions at night, whatever it is, we want to just get to know what that is with as few preconceptions or theoretical ideas as we can have going towards it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So, Bob, have you found value in integrating, IFS with other therapeutic approaches or practices such as Gestalt therapy or spiritual tradition in your work, with your, set of clients?
Well, a lot of people are working on integrating IFS with EMDR
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
and with focusing. Eugene
Mm-hmm.
Gendlin's school and
Mm-hmm.
what's her Ann Cornell Weiser, a wonderful, wonderful therapist in the focusing tradition. I think that's okay. I don't have any problem with that. I think where IFS hasn't gone as far as I want it to go is in the direction of integrating with spiritual traditions. I think,
Mm-hmm.
it's in the West, it's very, very hard to talk about spirit and spirituality in a therapy room. When I was trained, we were told not to. Keep your nose out of that. That has nothing to do with healing. And now I'm thinking that's absolutely insane to say that. So more and more, I think IFS sets a stage or creates a foundation when we can help people's systems stop being this internal civil war, start to be a cooperating team, and release these hidden capsules of pain. Because if you've got a bunch of these hidden capsules of pain, it's like carrying a huge sack of rocks over your shoulder. You're going to be tired all the time and exhausted. It's a big burden. So when that's all done, that sort of clears the ground so that we can have contact with spirit in a good way, in a very powerful way. And those profound, ancient energies can start moving through us and out into the world. And
Mm-hmm.
I think the concept of self sort of opens the door. The MAPS people, the MDMA research people, they talk
Mm-hmm.
about inner healing intelligence. I think they're absolutely right. Every human being I've met has some deep intelligence, they have ancient wisdom in their bones, in their tissues, in their breath. And I think it's my job to help them connect to that. I'm not this big fancy healer out here. I'm just pretty good at getting the garbage off that stuff, so that they can connect with who they really are. So I think expanding therapy more and more into a spiritual direction, that's
Mm-hmm.
the direction I'm going in.
Mm-hmm. Great. So, Bob, IFS, emphasizes compassion and understanding towards all parts. I mean, we need to be respectful, we need to be compassionate. I agree, to that. Even, those that behave in harmful ways. I mean, that's what IFS advocates, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it teaches us
Yeah.
to be respectful. But, I mean, there's a question, in my mind, but don't you think that in wrong hands, without proper boundaries, this approach could, potentially be misused, to justify or excuse abusive behavior? I mean, allowing abuser to evade accountability and responsibility.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, anything can be misused. there's a wonderful idea. I think it started with Buddhism, but maybe not, called near enemies. That every great virtue has a far enemy, but it also has a near enemy. For example, equanimity, one of the four great immeasurables, they call them, I think, in Buddhism. Equanimity, the far energy is upset, agitated, rageful, all that kind of stuff. That's pretty obvious. You can tell the difference easily. The near enemies of equanimity are numbness, indifference, closed, all kinds of, those can be really hard to tell what's what. And I've come to think I think this is just Bob's idea.
Mm-hmm.
The greater the value, the greater the virtue, the more important that quality is, the more damaging its near enemy is. So yeah, everything can be misused. Everything. The most sacred, the most wonderful qualities on the planet can be misused horribly.
So, Bob, this IFS, can it be an intersection between spirituality and psychology?
I think so. I hope so. I'm pushing in that direction.
But, what makes you push in that direction, Bob, if you could just...
Well, what really opened it up was that first case I described with the unattached burden. I thought that stuff was, I did not want to hear about that. And then all these other clients kept coming to me, and I got to go. I had this pretty neat trauma-oriented psychotherapy worldview. I'd edited 4 scholarly books on the subject. I thought I knew what I was doing. And then all of a sudden this comes along, and now I think, well, all this trauma-oriented stuff is still real, but there's a much bigger universe around it. And we need to start paying attention to that. And I'll go even further. I think our world is in a terrible, terrible mess. And, I'm not alone in that. But Ian McGilchrist, who I think is another one of the great, great intellects alive on our planet today, he said, we're not going to heal this by fighting those political battles that all these people are fighting in such a hideous way. He says, well, the only thing that will heal this is changing our consciousness. And he said, and changing our consciousness is one person at a time. And he says, I know this can seem absolutely overwhelming, but he says he's become convinced that if only 3% of the people on the planet change their consciousness, that means heal, that will be enough to change the course of the world, which seems to be going down in a very bad direction. So that's, you know, and that's what I feel I can do. I do what I think I can do. So I focus on this idea of changing consciousness. And by healing the individuals, we can heal much, much bigger things.
Mm-hmm. So, Bob, I mean, what are your views? I mean, did religious people or spiritual people, community, tribe, did they have access to, the kind of information that you are, talking about? Did our ancestors have, somewhat, that kind of a knowledge back then that we are discovering now? Are you saying that? Do you agree to that?
Many of them, yeah, many of them knew more than we do.
So basically,
the part they're missing is this sort of foundation that IFS and trauma-oriented psychotherapy provide, that we can clean up all this trouble and wounds and pain that's, for most people, in the foreground and prevents them from going into these deeper spiritual levels. I don't think we can just jump over all of that and go into some kind of spiritual world. I think we actually have to move through that all patiently and lovingly and heal it. But I could be wrong. What do I know?
So basically, I mean, people like Schwartz, people like you, I mean, they are in a way, giving words to certain phenomena which was just considered spiritual, holy, or maybe possession. You guys are giving technical terms. You guys are actually, educating people like us and around that what could be, the possibility, what could that phenomena be? It's not just that something entering in you. It might already be there in the first place. It might be existing, since the time you are there on this planet. Wonderful. And, Bob, to tell you honestly, when I work with people, I mean, as a therapist, sometimes when we touch certain areas of their life and experience, I see something that comes, something that peeks through them. And that's like, I don't wish to talk about it. You are not allowed in this domain. You're not allowed. And for a moment, I used to feel that, is this client really possessed? And then my rational mind was like, no, there's no such thing that and all this is crap. These things don't exist. But then now when I'm reading you, other people, Schwartz, I'm able to understand that these are parts of them. It's nothing alien and foreign. But there is a huge lot of people who are into pathologizing. A lot of expression, a lot of different ways of reaction. They simply label it that this is not right, this is wrong, this could be this could be that. But I mean, I like your standpoint. I mean, never pathologize things. I mean, just be respectful towards whatever is coming through. And yes, I mean, I would love to explore more about IFS and integrate it into my sessions, because I personally feel traditional therapy didn't help me. Me being a victim and survivor, it didn't help me, honestly.
Yeah.
It did not help me. It was just sitting for 2 hours and I was writing, the therapist was writing, and we were just talking about things. It was not making any substantial change. There was something in me which kept telling me that you need to jump and kill yourself. And I was in therapy for 2 years. And strangely, and one of the days when I was high on mushroom, I mean, this is a personal experience, I confronted that voice. I said, why are you so interested in this, feeble weakling? Just go and find some better person. Just leave her. She's good for nothing. She's already suffering. And from that day onwards, Bob, I didn't hear that voice again. I mean, you are an expert. You can actually, tell us, I mean, what could these be? I personally feel with your theory, IFS information, it could be an unattached body, maybe with traumatic experience, surgery. I mean, it could be anything. But yes, it did haunt me for quite some time. It was a scary experience. Now, coming to, I mean, since we have actually, talked a lot about a lot of things, and, now we are moving towards the end of, this discussion, and I'm looking forward to have you again for different topics, and, maybe another topic where we can discuss, the effect of, drugs and mushrooms, LSD, MDMA. We can talk about those things. So before we, conclude today's session, Bob, I would want to know, what guidance would you offer to therapists and coaches who are beginning to incorporate IFS into their practice, particularly when working with clients, dealing with deep-seated trauma? What are your, views? What
Okay.
is your suggestion?
Respect, respect, respect. Kindness, kindness, kindness. And
Wow.
yeah. The other thing is, Dick has 8 C's that characterize self when we're really in self. And I always forget a few of them, but it's curiosity, compassion, clarity, connection, courage. There's a couple more. The most important of these, and the one if I don't have this one on board, I will stop the session and say, give me a minute. I need to work with my parts so that I can get back here. And that's curiosity. If you are not genuinely curious about what's going on in that human being in front of you, you need to stop the session and work with yourself. Every human being is a totally unique being. There'll never be another one like it again. And even if you sat with them for hundreds and hundreds of years, they would still remain a mystery. So don't start slapping a label on them. Stay curious. Welcome them. And there's 2 kinds of curiosity. One you can think of as Sherlock Holmes, like, I want to figure out an answer to this problem. And, and as you go into that kind of curiosity, your focus gets tighter and narrower and more precise, and you focus in and you solve the problem. And when that kind of curiosity is complete, the problem's solved, it's over, it's dead, it's done. There's another kind of curiosity I would call heart curiosity. Feels the same at the beginning, but as you move in that direction, instead of this narrowing of consciousness, you open your consciousness. And you notice, as I focus on this human, what happens in my chest? All your sensory modalities. And as you move in this direction, you don't get closed on an answer. You start moving towards wonder and excitement, maybe, and then awe, and then even like ecstasy and this sense of the vast mystery that every human being is, every single one. And that's the kind of curiosity you need, this heart-centered curiosity. And when you're in that genuinely, healing happens. You don't have to do a whole hell of a lot.
Wow.
People respond to that at a very profound level.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I'd say. I had wanted, years ago, I had set up a training to do a training in IFS in India. But at the last minute, it fell apart for a bunch of unfortunate reasons. But yeah, I hope something gets offered. And there are people, in addition to the Institute, providing trainings.
I'm sure. I'm going to mention your email. So a lot of my therapist friends and coaches and who are interested in this topic and domain, you can, reach out to Bob. And yes, he's always there to educate us. Thank you so much, Bob, for joining us today. It was a great honor. And I'm looking forward to have you again with another topic soon.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Bob.
Thank you, Sarah. Great talking with you. Bye-bye.